in recent days. There was a story about Canadian HMCS Vancouver, Canadian naval vessel, alongside Japanese and American vessels patrolling in the South China Sea a few days ago, which to me is another example of an unnecessary, provocative move vis-a-vis China. Canada going along with the American campaign. Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East had a report based upon accessed information files about Canada's voting record against Palestinians at the United Nations, which they found that internally the Canadian diplomats said that Canada voting against all the resolutions supporting Palestinian rights was not based on, quote, merit, that it contradicted, quote, Canadian values, interests, and standard positions, and that, quote, it has set us apart from like-minded countries. So really talking about how isolated Canada is at the UN voting against Palestinian rights, and kind of gives some context on why Canada lost the bid for a seat on the UN Security Council. The Palestinian votes were definitely one of the single most important factor. We released a letter a couple of days ago, signed by Chomsky, Linda McQuaig, Sven Robinson, Roger Waters, and others, 40 groups, calling on the NDP to withdraw from the Canada-Israel Interparliamentary Group, which is designed to deepen friendship with Israel between the Canadian Parliament and Knesset. And the NDP, the letter kind of hones in on the fact that the NDP has increasingly suggested that Israel is an apartheid state. And if you're going to suggest it's an apartheid state, it's pretty incoherent to be part of an Israel lobby group pushing for more, for deeper connections, stronger bonds, deeper cooperation with that apartheid state. And if people haven't already, I really invite people to send a letter to the NDP leader, Jagmeet Singh, and others within the party, calling on them to withdraw from the to disassociate from the Canada-Israel Interparliamentary Group. And if somebody could put that link in the chat, that would be much appreciated. Canadian Dimension yesterday, I believe, published an interesting article from Owen Schock about Canada's connection to the Maracana massacre, where 34 miners were killed 10 years ago in South Africa. It's just the anniversary just passed. And the point of the article was, it goes over not only how Canada was actually supportive of apartheid South Africa until much, much later than people widely claim. That's pretty widely known, but also about how Canada really promoted a pro-mining policy amidst the disintegration of the apartheid regime. There was some kind of openness to a more socialistic outlook that had been the Freedom Charter. The ANC, African National Congress, had a socialistic kind of vision, and the Canadian government played an important role in diverting that socialistic direction. So, get rid of the overt racism, but maintain the basic economy that had been built up during the apartheid regime. That's what the Canadian government worked to do. And also Canadian mining companies played an important role in pushing back against efforts to shift the ownership structure within the mining sector. The ANC had been pushing for a greater role for Black ownership within mining companies. And it was actually the Canadian mining industry that were the main players in the early 2000s pushing back against that policy. So the point of the Canadian Dimension piece is to sort of say that Canada had contributed to the political economic climate in which this massacre took place, where 34 miners were killed. I believe 78 were wounded. Quite a horrible, were killed by the South African police. And there was another story on the Maple that talked about how 6 months ago, Canadian officials D&D, Department of National Defense officials said explicitly that Canada wasn't providing training or support, would not provide training or support to the Azov battalion or affiliated entities in Ukraine. So they wouldn't support far-right military within Ukraine. Now, 6 months later, they're no longer saying that. So they backed away from that position, which is interesting. Not that surprising because we know, of course, Canadian weapons have been almost certainly going to far-right forces. And the restarting of training mission in the UK, likely there's some far-right types that part of that training, and Canadian Special Forces on the ground. So it's just interesting to see 6 months later, the Canadian military is backing away from this. They could still have been supporting the Azov battalion, but now they're not even, quietly, but now they're not even publicly saying that position, which goes to partly the fact that in recent months, the Azov battalion and other sort of neo-Nazi forces in Ukraine have been very much whitewashed by the dominant media in this country. Another thing just to mention tonight, the United Jewish Appeal of Toronto, the biggest Jewish organization in the country, effectively the biggest promoter of apartheid, because they're the ones that finance the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs. They are hosting in Toronto, they are hosting, as we speak, George W. Bush and Stephen Harper for a chat as part of the launching of their fundraising drive. So I know there's a protest that happening in front of the hotel. Hopefully it's significant, but it's just amazing to see how these, particularly George W. Bush, with the level of blood on his hands in Iraq, is able to, come to Toronto with very little critical attention focused on it. And he's, now a respectable politician. And it says a lot about the political culture in this country. So on Thursday, I believe it was Thursday, maybe it was Wednesday, I believe it was Thursday's front page of the National Post was a story basically admitting that Canada's campaign to overthrow Venezuela's government had failed. It was kind of, I forget the title, but it was like, we tried to get rid of the dictator and the dictator won. I believe that was the title. So not really framing it in properly, but admitting, long article, admitting that Canada's bid to overthrow Venezuelan government had failed. Also, of course, yesterday was the 49th anniversary of Augusto Pinochet's overthrow of the elected president, Salvador Allende, in Chile. So I thought that today would be a good day to have a discussion of Canada's role in overthrowing governments, mostly progressive elected governments that ran afoul of Washington, and usually Ottawa, the US was the main player. In Chile, in 1973, Canada played not a significant role, but beyond passive support for the coup. So actually, Canada's opposition to Allende goes back to the previous election in '64, where Allende was defeated, and the Canadian government basically worked to support Eduardo Frei, the conservative alternative. And then when Allende was elected, the Canadian government cut off Export Development Canada credits or other bilateral assistance. It's voted at the IMF to cut off International Monetary Fund loans to Chile. Pierre Trudeau refused to go to Chile. He was invited by Allende, and he didn't want to ruffle the feathers of Washington and right-wing forces. So Canada contributed to the destabilization of the Allende government. Within 3 weeks of the coup, the Trudeau government recognized the military junta. The infamous cable that were leaked by Canadian officials from the Canadian ambassador in Santiago about what was happening in the days after the coup are quite revealing on the attitude of the Canadian embassy, and I think to a large extent External Affairs, now of course called Global Affairs Canada. And the ambassador said, quote, "Reprisals and searches have created panic atmosphere affecting particularly expatriates, including the riffraff of the Latin America left, to whom Allende gave asylum. The country has been on a prolonged political binge under the elected Allende government, and the junta has assumed the probably thankless task of sobering Chile up." The sobering up process, of course, meant killing thousands of people. At the time of the cable, there were thousands, I think maybe even into tens of thousands, being held at the major football pitch, infamously in Santiago. And so that was the attitude of the Canadian ambassador. So very much aligned with this sort of, okay, you're killing a bunch of people, but this is, what was needed. So for me, Canada has been involved in more than 15 US-backed, passively or actively supported, more than 15 US-backed coups. The Pinochet coup is about in the mid kind of range of how active Canada was. There's 8 coups that I identify. There may be more that I don't know, but this is just that I've come across in my research. The 8 coups where Canada was passive supporter, and the passive can mean, started diplomatic relations after the government was overthrown. In the case of Arbenz in Guatemala, the 8 passive coups that I list are Mohamed Mossadegh in Iran in 1953, Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954, Juan Bosch, Dominican Republic, João Goulart, 1963, Goulart, 1964, Sukarno in Indonesia, that played out over a bit of time, Milton Obote in Uganda, Fernando Lugo in Paraguay in 2012, and Dilma Rousseff in Brazil in 2016. Those are the 8 where Canada sort of passively supported the coups. And there's, I'm not going to get into all the details of how they did that, but they clearly went along, aligned with those coups in all those cases. The Pinochet example is one of a bit more active engagement, but there's a number of other more active engagement. Manuel Zelaya in Honduras in 2009 is one of those examples, where if you look at all the rhetoric of the Harper government, it legitimated the coup. Before the coup, after the coup, whole bunch of statements. Canada was accused of giving oxygen to the coup forces by the ousted foreign minister. They failed to suspend their military training program with the military had just overthrown Zelaya. Canada was the only major donor that didn't announce that it was cutting off aid to Honduras after the coup. And they, after a really dubious election, 6 months later, they immediately recognize the government. So not a deep engagement, but clear, beyond just passive support, kind of active support for this ouster of Zelaya, who was a modest reformist who started becoming aligned a little bit with the Venezuela-led ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance of the Americas. Another example of a bit more kind of beyond just sort of passive support towards a bit more active is Evo Morales in Bolivia in 2019, where the Trudeau government, Chrystia Freeland, put out a statement right after the military forced Morales out of the country. And it said, quote, "Canada stands with Bolivia and the democratic will of its people. So after the military intervened to oust the elected president, and we should point in this case, I'm not getting into all the details, but no one denied that Evo Morales still had 2 months left in his term, right? There was a dispute over elections. I'll get into that in a second. But at this point, he still had 2 months left in his term that no one denied. So at this point is clearly a usurpation of an elected president. The Canadian government went much beyond that, and they really supported they had Canadian officials in the Organization of American States electoral mission. That is what helped to legitimate the coup. And basically, the OAS electoral mission claimed there was dubious counting in the vote for the presidential election, and this was complete nonsense. They basically said that the margin of victory, Morales had won by more than 10%. That's what he needed. He needed to win by 10% to not have a second round, and he was right close to that 10% mark. And then as the votes came in from the more rural places, his margin of victory kept getting bigger. Everyone understood that in the more indigenous parts of the country, Morales got, in some cases, 90% of the vote, which is, even in the U.S., there's some areas of, like black neighborhoods in Detroit that vote 90% or more Democrat. So this was not a surprise, but the OAS acted like this was a surprise, acted like there was some funny business, and that's part of what fueled the protests, which ultimately kind of created the context in which the military intervened. And the Canadian government really stoked that. They stoked that very, actively, and they financed the OAS mission. And like I said, they had members part of it. The public statements that the Canadian officials made legitimated, and then the coup. A year later, the coup was. It was absolutely clear that it was a coup when Morales's former finance minister won the vote by a very large margin, and Morales's party won by a very large margin, and so the Canadian role in that was sort of somewhat exposed for those at least who were paying a bit of attention. There's the Hamas's election, the Palestinian legislative election in 2006, where Canada played a role, immediately cut off aid to the Palestinians and tried to create the civil war within Palestinians. That's another, Hamas I don't think is a social democratic or progressive government, but nonetheless, it's an example where Canada worked very clearly to undermine the voting of Palestinians. Another coup where Canada was more engaged in was Patrice Lumumba in the Congo. And there's many facets to that one, but Canadian officials tried to undermine Lumumba. The Canadian peacekeepers that were sent to the Congo, which were supposed to be sent to deal with a territorial dispute, the UN force worked to undermine Lumumba. And Canadians dominated the intelligence of the UN mission, and they took very aggressively anti-Lumumba positions to the point where Canadian Colonel Jean Berthiaume, years later, decades later, boasted about how he told Mobutu where Lumumba was, and sent troops to go recapture Lumumba. And not long later, he was ultimately killed. But the Prime Minister Diefenbaker said Lumumba was a major threat to Western interests. Canadian officials were very happy after Lumumba was deposed and killed. So that's another example where Canada played a pretty active role. In this case, after the Belgians and the Americans, Canada, I think, was the third most active player in undermining and ultimately assassinating or helping to assassinate Patrice Lumumba, who was an independence leader of the Congo and viewed as a important Pan-Africanist. Another Pan-Africanist they helped undermine and overthrow was Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana. The main way that was done was by Canada's military training mission, which was designed to, after the independence, Ghana's independence, The British military trainers stayed for quite a while, and then they were ultimately pushed out, and Canadian military trainers replaced them, and they basically worked to keep the Ghanaian military as aligned to the West, to Britain, to the US. And there's all the internal files are all public. They've been released about Canada's role, and there's a couple of books that go into this, and they show very clearly how Canadian officials boasted that the Ghanaian military stayed maintained as the most pro-Western institution. And at one point, Nkrumah even tried to set up another parallel kind of presidential guard to check the power. He understood that the military were very pro-British still. And Canadian officials played this central role in this process. Canada's High Commissioner, after Nkrumah was ousted, said, quote, "A wonderful thing," this is what he cabled to Ottawa. He said, quote, "A wonderful thing has happened for the West in Ghana, and Canada has played a worthy part." They immediately after Nkrumah was overthrown, they announced they're going to continue normal relations. They announced an aid package to Ghana. So in Ghana, Canada played a substantive, clearly far beyond passive, active role in that coup. Another one that's quite politically relevant to today is with Viktor Yanukovych in Ukraine, and the kind of pro-Canadian intervention Ukraine people frame Canada's role in ousting Yanukovych as just supporting the Maidan protests that began in late 2013. But this is nonsense. Immediately, the Harper government begins, when Yanukovych is elected, elections that Canadian observers oversaw and said were, good elections. Organization Security Cooperation in Europe, same thing, said this is good, this display of democracy. The Harper government immediately starts criticizing Yanukovych. Constant. There's a whole series of measures they start taking, public criticism of Yanukovych, obviously stoking the division within the country between the western part of Ukraine and the southeastern part of Ukraine that tended to be more pro-Russian. One of the things Yanukovych did was he legislated neutrality, right, for Ukraine, which means they couldn't join NATO, which that went against what Canada wants for Ukraine. And so also Canadian government is funding opposition groups, and they've been doing that for years. And I've written about the most high-profile example around the 2004 Orange Revolution, where Canada was intervening and supporting opposition civil society groups. That process has been going on since, before the fall of the Soviet Union, but certainly throughout the 90s onwards. And those they're supporting are the Western-oriented, both in the physical sense of generally in the west of Ukraine and in the European Union, NATO-oriented forces within Ukraine. Canada's been funding those opposition groups for many years, but concretely during the Maidan protests, you had Foreign Minister John Baird actually going to Maidan Square during a protest, right? This is the Foreign Minister of Canada going to an anti-government protest. Clear intervention in Ukrainian affairs that violates the UN Charter. You had Canada sanctioning Yanukovych officials. You had the Canadian embassy being used as a base of opposition to Yanukovych for more than a week. This is reported on by Canadian press. So this is getting to be some fairly active Canadian role in the overthrow of an elected president. And I know that Yanukovych, lots of accusations of corruption. I believe a lot of that is true. So I don't think Yanukovych doesn't fall into the category of a sort of progressive social democratic president. That's not. I don't think he's equivalent to an Arbenz or certainly not Allende. Nonetheless, is it Canada's role to foment the unconstitutional ouster of an elected president then we can see what that has led to. That's what led to the civil war in Ukraine, and which is one of the contributing factors to the horrible war that's going on now. So Yanukovych is getting to be pretty active Canadian support. Quite a number of different ways in which the Canadian government is involved. Probably the most intense Canadian coup against a social, this in the case, it's clearly social democratic, reformist, anti-imperialist leader and political party was in Haiti in 2004. And Canada's role there is, they fund opposition groups. They had that Ottawa initiative on Haiti where they bring together the international forces that would perpetrate the coup, the US, Canada, France, the Organization of American States. They all kinds of diplomatic efforts to isolate Aristide's government, all kinds of, they go along, they support these aid cutoff, both through the Inter-American Development Bank. So at one point, the Aristide government was paying loans paying interest on a loan that had been agreed to by the previous government, but they never got the money. The Americans, with the Canada supporting it, blocked the funding, but then Aristide was forced to pay. Their government was forced to pay interest on it. Canada basically cut off aid, and then immediately after the government's ousted, the aid spigot really kicks into gear by the Canadian government. Canadian troops, of course, were involved, militarily invading as part of the Americans taking Aristide. So really, Canada was involved. We haven't found a direct connection between the Canadian government and the paramilitaries that came in from the Dominican Republic to undermine the Aristide government. There's some evidence Canadian Mining Company was accused of having funded some of the opposition, Saint Geneviève. That's Peter Hallward reported on that. But the Canadian government, whether they did or didn't, whether they had a direct hand in the paramilitary forces, I don't know. I presume to guess they probably didn't. But in every other facet of the coup in Haiti, the opposition protests, all kinds of Canadian aid money going to opposition groups. The head of the Group of 184 opposition was the main subcontractor of Gildan Activewear, Montreal-based company. So really, Canada's hands on the coup in Haiti, it deserves, a full book or close to it at least. Very, very involved in that coup. Another coup, just to conclude, that unfortunately, as I began with the front page of the National Post, probably the only other coup where you could say something close to as engaged as in Haiti is with Venezuela and the bid to overthrow Maduro. And that's really a remarkable campaign. Fortunately, in that case, it's a failure, but the Canadian government, headed up established the Lima Group, headed it up, this group of opposition to the Venezuelan government. And it was set up because they weren't having success in getting all of the Organization of American States to go along with their campaign against Venezuela. That's why they set up the Lima Group. You have imposing 4 rounds of sanctions. You have bringing Venezuela to the International Criminal Court. You have financing of opposition groups, and that's been going on for many years. Obviously, a media campaign, and then you have, to put it on, all together, you have the Canada helping for multiple weeks, according to a number of media reports, to bring the Venezuelan opposition behind the idea of making Juan Guaido, declaring himself president of the country in a Caracas park, and Canada also playing a role in bringing the international forces rallying behind Guaido, and then that goes on for years, right? So, effectively, it still goes on to today, where Canada claims that Guaido is the official representative. The Venezuelan government's not allowed to have the functioning embassy in Ottawa, diplomatic apparatus in Canada, et cetera, et cetera. So that's quite an aggressive, I would say, on par with Haiti in terms of being so deeply, the Canadian government been so deeply implicated in this coup process. So I have to count this out, but I think it's 16 or 17 examples of Canada being involved in the overthrow of governments, mostly against social democratic or socialist oriented governments, always alongside the U.S. There is, as far as I know, there is no example where Canada led the charge, was the main doing it alone, if you like. But I don't think that the Canadian government, you can find a lot of examples where I don't think the Canadian government was necessarily forced into their position. I don't think that's to explain Canada's role in Venezuela. It's not just being forced. Chrystia Freeland and Trudeau government in general, a willing participant in that campaign, and that goes for a number of the other examples. Certainly Yanukovych in Ukraine, Lumumba, Nkrumah, and Zelaya. So I'll leave it at that. And if people have comments or questions, and I think I might have the same problem I've had recently about not seeing the hands go up. So if
your first question is for Laurel, and then it's your first question is from Laurel, and then it's from Laura. Eve,
go ahead, Laurel. Thank you, Yuri.
Welcome.
Laurel, you're muted.
You're muted.
Thanks. Do you see a difference between political parties, the two big ones, the Conservatives and the Liberals, with respect to these coups? Do you see any quarreling between the two parties about what was done in the name of the Canadian people, and in resistance to what was done by the other party, and any kind of debate over whether or not the things that were done should have been done? And I mean not just the Liberals and the Conservatives, but also the NDP. And
that's some interesting question. Like Stockwell Day, the day after, 2 days after, might have been just before, but I think it was just a couple of days. He actually put out he about the coup in Haiti in 2004. This is again Stockwell Day. The right wing of the Conservative Party. He basically said this was a coup, and maybe this was the right thing to do, but got to be careful about overthrowing other countries' governments or something like that. It was in some way it was quite an honest assessment of what went on. Sven Robinson, as the NDP foreign critic at that point, also he believe he called for the tabling of the Ottawa Initiative meeting on Haiti. So that was a clear example. The NDP, that was what I would call like an anti-imperialist critique of what Canada did in Haiti. They dropped it. The NDP dropped it really quickly, but they did immediately after. They did ask some questions. In the case of actually interesting of Yanukovych, the NDP also asked a pretty made it, even though they kind of along with the general thrust, and if on Ukraine, all the parties are in complete alignment, right? And they've been that way for a long time. This didn't start after Russia's invasion. But there is this comment about there's a House of Commons criticism that Dewar, who was then the NDP foreign critic, I'm forgetting, not Gary Dewar, no.
Paul Dewar.
Paul Dewar, yeah. But he made of John Baird going to the Maidan Square, right? I mean, it's pretty outrageous. The Canadian foreign minister going to the square of a big mobilization against the government, calling to overthrow the government. That's obviously a pretty big deal. So there's these moments where there's these sort of some comment. Is there any, let me just think this through for a second here. Is there any sustained that I'm familiar with, again, like in 54 in Guatemala, there's some criticism. The CCF asked some questions of Lester Pearson, who was then the foreign minister, the external minister, who denies that the Americans are involved in this coup in Guatemala. that's one of the ways in which the sort of passive Canadian support is that Pearson denies that this is sort of kind of U.S. sponsored invasion taking place, and so there's some questioning. I believe in the case of Lumumba in the Congo, there's some questioning from the CCF, but overwhelmingly it's around the edges. Now, the difference between the conservatives and the liberals is an interesting one, because the worst coup is Haiti in 2004, and that's liberals, right? That's a Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin government. So you can't, that's the most clear-cut coup, and its ramifications were, of course, terrible. So I don't think there's some like real fundamental functioning. I mean, Harper was, on Ukraine with Yanukovych, Harper was extreme. Like Harper himself goes to Ukraine twice in 2 months after the coup, right? He wants to shore up support for the unconstitutional change of power so much that like Canadian Prime Minister, I mean, this is a long distance. This is, again, this unconstitutional government in place 2 times in 2 months. That's really taking a personal initiative to, say we give our stamp of approval to this unconstitutional change of power.
Yeah,
So that I don't think Trudeau would have done something that aggressive. Maybe he would have gone there once, but and he was also the first G7 leader to go to Ukraine. Harper was after the coup. So
it's interesting that they don't quarrel about it. They don't take different stands. The parties don't take different stands. They don't sort of fight each other over foreign policy. It's like they agree on the foreign policy. Everybody agrees this is the right thing to do.
And I would say what we can say with like basically 100%. I'd say that there are, like, the NDP, if I remember correctly, with Morales being overthrown in Bolivia, there was a question or two from NDP MPs or whatever. There is what we can say with absolute clear, in other cases, like I said, Haiti, Sven Robinson mentioned, what we can say with complete clarity is to my mind, I can't think of an example where the NDP took it up, like not just as like, okay, we raise it one time in the House of Commons, we make one quote in the paper, but actually sort of like took the issue up and stuck with it and said, hey, well, this is something that we think that this is really wrong. We think we can, mobilize people against the government for whatever reason they come up with. There is no example that I can think of where they did that against the Canadian-backed coup, from Venezuela to Haiti to, the historic. Obviously, I wasn't paying attention. I wasn't alive for a number of the early ones, so I wasn't as, following things as closely. But I'm basically certain that has never happened.
Yeah, yeah. It's really sad. Really, really sad. Yep.
Go ahead, Laura.
Okay, so I just wanted to know, given Canada's close alignment with the US on coups and everything in foreign policy, really, do you know that when Canada lost its bid twice to get on the Security Council, was there any suggestion that people just didn't see any daylight between Canada and the US? They're just like one and the same. If you could answer that. And also, I was wondering if you could tell us where the Lima Group stands right now, like what's happening with that.
Yeah, I think that is one of the number one factor in a kind of like, one instance was the anti-Palestinian votes of Canada being completely isolated on UN votes on Palestine at the UN. So all the UN ambassadors would see how Canada is going with the US, Israel, Micronesia, and Paolo, and while every other country is voting in favor of Palestinian rights. So that's a really concrete example where the UN ambassador for Uganda would see, how sort of offside Canada is. So that was I think the most concrete in the one sense. What you pointed to is probably the bigger picture main reason why not to vote for Canada. It was like, what's the point of having another US on the Security Council, right? It just, so that's that. And then the what was the second question again?
Oh, I just want to know where's the Lima Group at right now?
Oh yeah, the Lima Group has never officially ended. Lima, as this new National Post article pointed out, which a number of people pointed out in previous articles, that Lima left the Lima Group, right? So the new Peruvian government withdrew from the Lima Group, so Lima is no longer in the Lima Group. So it, from a PR perspective, the whole point of the Lima Group, the reason it was called the Lima Group and not the it really was the Ottawa. It was Ottawa and Peru. It was Ottawa pushing Peru to do this. So they didn't want to call it the Ottawa Group. You could argue it really was the Washington Group, right? And it was Ottawa being sort of outshored to, Washington offshoring it to Ottawa, and then Ottawa getting Peru behind it. Calling it Lima Group was a PR exercise to a large extent. But yeah, it's never formally ended, but it's effectively defunct. It hasn't met in, I think, probably like a year and a half now. And at the same time, the other Latin America, like the CELAC, the Community of Caribbean Latin American Nations, has met, like and Maduro was invited to the meeting in, I think it's September in Mexico City. So the other sort of diplomatic forums that the Lima Group was effectively in opposition to, those have started meeting again, and that kind of direction of things has grown, whereas the Lima Group is defunct. It's essentially dead. They're never going to admit it's dead. And again, this National Post article, there's nothing new in this National Post article, and the framing of it was kind of like, dubious, but considering how bad the coverage is on this issue, and we should remember that, in that right after Guaido declared himself president, and it looked like we were going to definitely get rid of the Venezuelan government, the Trudeau government was boasting about all this, right? They had a Lima Group meeting about 2 weeks, 10 days, I think, after Guaido declared himself president in Ottawa. And this was like the top news item. You had Chrystia Freeland going and doing the interviews in all the different media outlets, and how great it was that Canada was leading this charge, and Canada, there's, was moral, whatever, right? This was like, they were really, the government was not in any way trying to hide anything. They were boasting those. So all that happens. And then as it fails, let alone the moral question of it all, just the failure of it, quiet. The media doesn't just absolutely ignores it. So the National Post putting it on the front page, even though it's like the way they framed it is like we tried to take out the dictator and the dictator won, just the recognition of the failure of that policy is in and of itself like a step forward from how the media kind of has done what they've done on this issue. It's the Lima Group's dead.
B. Sandu has a question for you, Eve, followed by Eileen Watson.
So Bhagwan Sandhu. Eve, I just want to pick up on that article, because I thought that was also extremely interesting, not so much as the content and what we know already, but the timing of it, and the fact that John Iverson, who's not known to even, remotely talk about foreign policy, certainly not in the way that he did in the article. I'd like to know your views. This is, I think it was 2 days before the crowning of Pierre Poilievre. Pierre Poilievre's, wife is Venezuelan, and she definitely does not come from a left-wing, family, or for that matter, centrist. What do you make of that? Because I found it astounding that Iverson in particular would write, given the twist and all that he took and the angles that should be expected. But I just want to hear your kind of, I don't know if you've thought about it or not, but to me, it was really like, it just threw me off the curve, say, what the hell type of a moment, right? That he would come out of left field and throw this thing, and all the timing and all of it. I mean, there's a whole image building going on. And particularly, I've been interested in knowing, does this signal anything, 6 months, 7 months to a year, or how the conservatives are going to approach this? Because in the US already, sort of low level rapprochement is starting to happen around oil and whatnot. So could you just talk about that? If like what's going on?
I feel like you've just done a good job of laying that out. I hadn't actually thought that too. I didn't know that about Poilievre's wife, and I hadn't really, connected that to Poilievre. And I mean, it does, what you're saying does make some sense, and certainly something to think about. But no, I didn't. I don't know, what the timing was or what the motivation and who's like feeding this to Iverson and all that stuff. But you're totally correct in that it was a bit out of like left field, and same thing. First of all, being on the front page, and then it being him, and yeah. So no, that is some kind of interesting things to consider. So if anyone else has any further ideas or thoughts, or if but yeah. Interesting questions.
My next, Eileen Watson. I thought that there was the constitution was defeated in Chile. Vijay Prashad had an article in Counterpunch today saying it was in part due to the evangelicals. Did you hear about that, or why the constitution was defeated?
So I couldn't hear you that well. I something about evangelicals, but I didn't actually hear the initial part.
That the constitution in Chile was defeated. The vote for the constitution was defeated. And Vijay Prashad said that.
Oh, Eileen, you're muted now.
So Vijay Prashad is saying it's tied to the evangelical vote in Chile. I can't say I don't know enough about the political dynamics in Chile to understand why the opposition, why the vote. I mean, it ultimately got defeated pretty badly, unfortunately. I know there's, the rejection of the previous constitution was higher margin. It was like towards 80%, and this was like 62% that voted against this. The sort of what's put out there from the sort of main kind of story is that it was, kind of going too far in a sort of progressive kind of direction too fast for Chileans. I don't know for sure if that's correct. But that's kind of how it's presented by, like, I don't know, the New York Times or whatever. But I know that the center left party opposed it, which is unfortunate. And that contributed, but I don't know enough about the internal dynamics within Chile to speak onto that, really.
So, Eve, somebody, I think, yes, I believe it's Norman wanted, I didn't quite understand what this question was. He was asking if you could comment on the turnover of Justin Trudeau when Fidel Castro died. And he says, do you think the OEA could change with all these progressive Latin American countries?
I think the OEA is the French acronym for Organization of American States, or I think the Spanish acronym as well. Yeah, I think the OAS is kind of like, it just needs to be replaced, and that's what CELAC should be. Obviously, if you have, it gets most of its money. I think half the money comes from the US. Next biggest donor is Canada. It's based in Washington. There's just so many ways in which the OAS is kind of like in the control of the sort of North American empire. But you can lessen. I think that if you do have more, kind of left-wing governments, it lessens the extent to which it goes sort of down that direction. And Amalgo, or the current head, really went in an aggressive direction. But yeah, with I think that, Trudeau and Cuba, there's a bit of, I think that, this is a little bit, it goes into the mythology. There's some truth to it. Trudeau, the kind of brand and his father, and the sort of, Viva Castro, and Viva Fidel, I guess it was, and you know, like this is, you know, it matters. It does matter. It's better than, you know, the alternative of like the kind of aggressive kind of position, but there's way too much made of the sort of Canada supposedly being kind of like a good ally of Cuba for, you know, what's for the reality of it. And you know, like, so if you go back and you look at why Canada didn't break relations after the Cuban Revolution, the only two countries in the hemisphere, US or Canada and Mexico, that don't break relations is because one of the reasons, central reasons, one, the Cubans nationalized Canadian banks, but they did so with compensation. But the other thing is the Americans didn't want Canada to break relations because they wanted Canada to spy on Cuba. And Canadian embassy spied on Cuba and provided decisive intelligence during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Right? This is all documented. This is not like, so, you know, does the relationship then go in a different direction by the mid 70s with, you know, Pierre Trudeau? You know, probably to some extent. It's not just rooted in the spying of the earlier period, but it's exaggerated. Like, it's the extent to which was sort of Canada being good ally with Cuba and all this kind of stuff is becomes part of this like mythology to frame Canada as this and Trudeau as this, you know, benevolent force in the hemisphere that's like, you know, fundamentally different than Washington in the hemisphere. And yeah, so I mean.
And Eve, while on the subject of Chile, since it's the anniversary of Chile's 9/11, which Canada was a part of, have you read anything about if Canadian mining companies or if and other sectors of Canada were involved in defeating the new constitution, which certainly was certainly much more progressive than the current Pinochet one.
Yeah, well, Canada had, I think it's like the Financial Post had a very big article, extensive article about the danger of before the vote, the danger of the constitutional changes for the Canadian mining sector in Chile. There's something like one story said, I think it's like 11% of all Canadian mining companies globally are in Chile. Okay, there's a lot of Canadian mining in Chile, and it's not just the mining sector, though I think they were probably more, you know, sort of most threatened by the changes. Though even that, my understanding of the Constitution, you know, it put more pressure on the mining sector, but it still wasn't, you know, maybe as far as I would like to see things go, or maybe all of us would like to see things go. But almost certainly, like I understand that there was a real hard disinformation campaign against the Constitution that was quite effective, of sort of demonizing what was actually in the Constitution. Private property was going to disappear and all this kind of stuff. And almost certainly the Canadian mining companies were in one way or another supporting that disinformation campaign. I don't have any proof of that, but I would be astounded if they weren't to some extent doing that. And it's not just Canadian mining companies. Canadian banks are major players in Chile, and also a whole bunch of the Canadian pension funds and stuff have major assets of like public works kind of assets in Chile. So I would presume that Canadian mining companies were engaged, but I haven't seen an article that kind of looked at how much, you know, whether they funded opposition or, you know, this kind of stuff. But I would presume that they did.
And we have some minutes left, and I'm just curious. We've been inundated here in Belgium. Our only English outlet is, you know, the BBC with coverage of Queen Elizabeth's passing. I'm just curious, has there been like a lot of coverage in the has there been a lot of coverage in Canada about that? And not that I'm dancing on her grave or anything, but just out of curiosity, I'm curious if there's been like a little too much coverage about it.
Yeah, my opinion is we should just nothing. I don't want to hear the left-wing critiques. I don't want to hear. I just want to just stop. Just I just do not care about the Queen. But there's been way too much attention, of course. Yeah, way too much attention. And I thought that Lisa Laflamme, to me, that was like really indicative of like, yes, Lisa Laflamme was turfed because of sexism, because of corporate interference, but she reappears working as a special correspondent for City News on the ground in London, and I watched a bit of this clip of her. It's just so embarrassing to see left-wing forces that like boast of her as being this like important Canadian journalist and this great and this was Nikki Ashton and Leah Gazan, the far left of the NDP, saying this about Lisa Laflamme, and apparently a big dispute she had with the CTV managers was over like more engagement in the Jubilee or whatever it was last year in not long ago in the Queen's Jubilee, I guess. So it's a grim. Honestly, everything to do with the Queen is very, very grim. Just makes you want to turn off. At the Bibliothèque Nationale, they have like all the local Canadian papers, the day, the proper day, and then they have the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times the day after. And so the day after, I was like, the only thing that made reading the newspapers bearable was that I could still read the ones that were, a day before the Queen had died. So there was actually worth reading versus the day of ones. But yeah.
I'm disappointed that the S&P apparently they once if they were to ever get independence from England, they still want the monarch as the head of state. To which I think, wow, like that just turns me off. Yeah, I completely agree with you.
So are there any other comments, questions? Otherwise, we're basically at 7 o'clock. So thanks everyone for coming out, and same place, same time next week. Take care. Good night.